Before we begin, if you believe that love can grow slowly, quietly, sometimes where we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. What you're about to hear isn't just a love story, it's a journey through silence, memory, and the kind of connection that changes everything. I was 24 when I married a man I barely knew. The gown wasn't mine. The ring was too heavy. The chandelier above us flickered slightly, as if it too hesitated at the vows we were about to exchange. I remember the silence most of all. Not the soft kind. The kind that rests gently between two people who understand each other. This was the cold silence of formality, of transactions, of resignation. No laughter, no music. Just the shuffling of expensive shoes on marble, and the steady voice of a lawyer reading out terms that sounded more like a contract than a promise. My hands trembled as I held the pen. He stood across from me, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, watching without watching. Ethan Grant. The name alone could buy cities, and now, me. Or rather, my last name, my family's debts, and a signature that would make me Mrs. Grant before I fully understood what that meant. "Everything is prepared," he said, voice low, measured. "You only need to sign." He didn't look cruel, but he didn't look kind either. Just resolved. I thought of my mother in that moment, her breath slow and fragile in the hospital bed, 2 towns away. She didn't know I was getting married today. I hadn't told her. Not because I didn't want her there, but because I didn't want her to see what this was. A girl selling herself with ink and silence. So I signed. They say, a wedding should feel like a beginning. Mine felt like a goodbye. To dreams, to freedom, to every version of love I used to believe in. The Grant estate was quiet, almost reverent in its elegance. Dark wood floors, gold fixtures, art that looked expensive but cold, like it was hung by someone who didn't care to feel anything from it. The bedroom I was led to had crisp white sheets, the kind you'd find in a high-end hotel. Not a home. There were no flowers, no scent of lavender or comfort. Just cedar, wax, and stillness. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the hem of my gown. One I had altered myself. It was secondhand, donated by a friend at the boutique I used to work in. I had sewn the lace tighter along the waist, not because I wanted it perfect, but because it gave me something to control. My suitcase sat in the corner, unopened. I had packed lightly, a few dresses, my mother's old teacup, and a worn Bible she always kept by her bedside. I took it out now, more for the weight of it in my hands than for anything spiritual. When I opened it, something slipped out. A folded piece of paper, aged and thin, with my mother's handwriting across the top. I stared at it for a moment, heart suddenly thudding like it did when I was a child caught sneaking cookies. I hadn't seen this letter before. "Dear Mr. Grant," it began. "I don't know if this will ever reach you. Perhaps it shouldn't. But I am writing it for my daughter, in case you ever meet her. She does not deserve the burden of her father's mistakes." I froze. My mother never spoke of my father much. He had disappeared from our lives when I was 10, leaving behind unpaid bills and silence. I knew he had betrayed people. I didn't. No, he had betrayed someone named Grant. The letter continued. "Your grandfather was a good man. He gave my husband more chances than he deserved. I still remember the day he came to our house with those sad eyes, asking nothing in return. If my daughter ever comes into your life, please, don't make her pay for what came before her." I felt the words hit me like cold water. Ethan Grant. E. Grant. Was he the same man? Could it be? This marriage, was it truly just about money? Or was it something more? A settlement of an old wound, generations old? I placed the letter down with trembling hands. It changed something in me. Not immediately, but like a seed dropped into still soil. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan had known more than he let on. That maybe, in the quiet way he looked at me without speaking, there was a story behind his silence too. Still, the bed felt too big that night, and the house too quiet. I pulled the sheets around me and listened to the wind outside pressing against the tall glass windows. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked. The kind that marked time not in seconds but in choices. That was the first night I spent as someone's wife. Not in love, not in hope, but in a kind of quiet surrender. And yet holding my mother's letter. Under my pillow, I found something strange in my chest. An ache that didn't feel like regret. It felt like the first crack in a wall I didn't know I had built around myself. And maybe, just maybe, it meant this story wasn't over yet. Mornings in the Grant estate arrived like uninvited guests, quiet, distant, and impossible to ignore. The sun touched everything softly, even the expensive wood floors and tall windows, as though it wasn't sure it belonged here. Neither was I. I walked the halls barefoot, the soles of my feet brushing against rugs I would never choose, in a house that wasn't mine. I hadn't seen Ethan since the wedding, not properly. He didn't come into the bedroom the first night, or the second. He hadn't tried to talk to me, nor did I seek him out. We were two people sharing the same space like strangers in a long train ride, aware of each other's presence, but too polite or too broken to speak. Every morning, I saw him from afar, standing behind the glass wall of the east wing, coffee in hand, staring into the pine trees beyond the estate. Always alone, always still. That's how I came to think of him, the man behind the glass, someone built for distance, someone who learned too early how to survive without warmth. There was something about his posture, though, that contradicted the coldness. The way his shoulders curved slightly inward, like the weight of something invisible was always there. A memory, maybe. Or a name he still carried in his chest. I wondered if my mother's name lived there too. The letter haunted me more than the silence between us. I had tucked it back into the Bible, unsure whether to burn it, hide it, or confront him with it. He hadn't given me a reason to speak, only that one glance during the wedding, and the instructions to sign my name. But there was something else now. A thread I couldn't unfeel. A memory planted before I was even born. I spent the third morning, sitting at the breakfast table alone. I picked at a slice of toast, the edges browned too perfectly. The staff here didn't smile. They weren't rude, but they didn't look me in the eye either. I was the young bride of a cold billionaire, likely a temporary figure, like the seasonal flowers they arranged in the entryway. But someone had placed a tray in front of me that morning, not just toast and eggs, but a small teacup filled with warm jasmine tea. The scent hit me before I saw it. My mother's favorite, the one she drank every time she was worried or tired or quietly grieving. It wasn't on the standard menu. I hadn't asked for it. No one had. I looked at the housekeeper, but she quickly busied herself with the silverware. The tea was already steeped, the temperature just right. Not hot, not tepid. Perfect, in a way only someone who paid close attention could manage. I didn't say a word. I simply placed my hands around the porcelain and let the steam brush against my face, like my mother's breath on my forehead when I was a child. That afternoon, I found myself drifting toward the east wing. I didn't intend to. I was just walking, or maybe searching for something I couldn't name. The glass wall stretched from floor to ceiling, a clean pane between the estate and the towering forest outside. Ethan stood there, back to me, coffee in one hand, the other tucked into his pocket. He was in a dark sweater this time, sleeves rolled, to his forearms. His profile was sharper than I remembered, like he was carved for silence. I almost left, but then I heard him speak. Your mother used to hum while she made jasmine tea. My breath caught. He didn't turn around. His voice was low, steady, almost like a prayer. I was 12 the last time I saw her. She had paint on her hands and told me not to tell your father she'd spent the grocery money on brushes. I stepped forward, slowly. You knew her. He nodded. A long time ago, before everything got complicated. Why didn't you say anything? Now he turned. His eyes were darker than I remembered, but not cold. Just tired. Just worn. Because you needed space to hate me if that's what it took to survive this. I didn't want to take that from you. I stared at him, unable to form words. He added, the tea. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It didn't, I whispered. It helped. Something shifted in the air between us. Not warmth, not yet, but a soft loosening. The kind that happens when someone opens a window in a long-closed room. That night, I sat in the bedroom alone again, but it didn't feel quite as cold. I lit the bedside lamp and opened my mother's Bible. I didn't read. I just ran my fingers along the edges of the paper, like touching something that had survived. The letter was still there. But now, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a key. Ethan was behind glass. But glass, after all, is not a wall. It's a surface waiting to be touched, waiting to reflect back what's real. And I was beginning to see the shape of a man whose silence wasn't cruelty. It was memory. And maybe, just maybe, he remembered me too. Some truths arrive not with a storm, but with the soft weight of inevitability. That morning, I returned home for the first time since the wedding. My mother's voice had trembled through the phone the night before, asking if I might come see her. Only if you have time, she'd said, though I knew her well enough to hear the tremor behind her grace. Ethan didn't say much when I told him. Just nodded and said he'd have the driver ready. Then as I was about to leave, he surprised me. I'll come with you. I blinked. You don't have to. He looked me in the eyes then. I know. We didn't speak much on the drive. The silence between us had changed, though. It no longer stretched like a canyon. It was quieter, softer, like shared breath on a winter window pane. My childhood. Home still smelled of peppermint oil and dust. The carpet creaked beneath our steps, and I half expected to hear my father's voice shouting from the back room, even though he'd been gone for years. But there was only my mother now, small and lovely in her armchair, wrapped in a blanket she had crocheted in better times. When she saw Ethan, something in her eyes flickered. Not surprise, recognition. She smiled, but didn't speak right away. I watched her fingers tighten slightly on the hem of her blanket. I wasn't sure you'd come, she finally said to him, voice thin like parchment. I owed it to you, Ethan said simply. I looked between them. You know each other. They both paused. My mother closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, misty and unguarded. I knew him before he had a name that mattered. Before the suits, before all this. Her hand gestured toward the man Ethan had become, but I sensed she was really pointing at something deeper, at a history I hadn't been allowed to touch. I used to paint. You know, she said softly, almost like an apology. Before the debts. Before your father took the little we had and gambled it away. I nodded. I'd seen the paintings in the attic. Dreamy oils of pine trees and foggy fields. I never knew. They were hers. I met Ethan's grandfather at a church art auction, she continued, years ago. He bought a piece I made for $10 more than it was worth, just to be kind. I saw Ethan smile then, barely, but it was there. He and your father became friends, she said, until they weren't. It was strange how pain made its own kind of silence in a room. I sat on the floor beside her, the way I had when I was small. My mother's fingers brushed my hair gently. Your father borrowed more than he could repay. Not just money, but trust. He broke promises. To his friend. To me. Her voice trembled again. When your father disappeared, it was Mr. Grant who helped me survive those first winters. He sent groceries. Paid your school fee once, though I told you it was a scholarship. Ethan shifted beside me, not speaking, just watching her with eyes that had known all this for years. And then, she said, looking at me, he died. Quietly. But not before he asked Ethan to promise him one thing. Take care of my family, not for revenge, not for repayment, but because some debts can only be settled in grace. I couldn't speak. All this time I thought I had been purchased, traded to a cold man for a ledger of unpaid bills. But now I saw the truth. I had been offered a place, not because I was useful, but because I was loved, once removed. Because a boy had grown into a man who honored a promise to someone long gone, even when no one remembered it. Later, Ethan and I sat on the porch. The sun had dipped just behind the trees, and the sky was lavender and gold. Quiet colors, the kind that don't ask for attention. I thought you hated him, I said. I did, Ethan answered. But hating someone doesn't erase the part of you that's still grateful. He sipped his tea, and I noticed for the first time that he drank it exactly the way I did. No sugar, just the faint bitterness of the leaf. I didn't marry you to punish you, he added after a moment. I married you because it was the only way I knew how to keep the promise. I looked at him, really looked. The boy who had once watched my mother paint. The young man who had carried anger not as a weapon, but as armor. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted you to choose who I was, not who your mother remembered, or who your father wronged. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It hummed with something unnamed. Not love, not yet, but something close to understanding. When he offered his hand to help me up from the porch, I didn't hesitate. His palm was warm, firm, familiar, somehow. And for the first time since our wedding, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a thread, a fragile connection that had somehow endured, passed between generations, waiting to be held again. It was the sound of the kettle that undid me. Not the soft whir of boiling water, but the clink of porcelain. Deliberate, unhurried. A sound I'd grown up with. A sound that used to mean everything would be okay, at least for that moment. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my childhood home, exhausted, numb from the day. My mother was resting, Ethan upstairs speaking with the doctor. The air was thick with quiet, and the faint scent of old wood and winter rain. Then I heard it. Clink, swirl, pour. I turned toward the stove, unsure what I expected. Maybe a nurse. Maybe my own memory playing tricks. But it was Ethan. He stood there, sleeves rolled, steam rising from the kettle in one hand, a teacup in the other. Not one of the house's chipped mugs, but my mother's old porcelain cup, the one with the pale blue rim and tiny crack near the handle. He didn't see me at first. He was humming, quietly. A tune I hadn't heard since I was a girl, sitting cross-legged on the linoleum, watching my mother brew jasmine tea on Sunday mornings. I didn't know Ethan remembered that melody, or that anyone else ever had. "You're humming?" I said, breaking the moment gently. He turned, just a little startled, then shrugged. It got stuck in my head. "She used to hum that when she was nervous," I said, stepping closer. She thought if she kept busy with her hands, her heart wouldn't feel so loud. He placed the teacup on the table in front of me. No words, just that simple act of care without condition. "Do you remember the first time you had tea here?" I asked him. He nodded, faintly amused. "Your mother offered it after she caught me sneaking a look at one of her paintings." I didn't know that. He smiled, almost shy. I was 10, thought I was being subtle. She said, "If you're going to stare that long, you might as well come in and try the tea." I laughed. The kind of soft, surprised laugh that comes when a piece of the past clicks unexpectedly into place. She always knew when someone needed warmth, I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not like I was a debt or a duty, but like he was, trying to see the part of me that remembered, the part that still carried my mother in the folds of my breath. "You remind me of her," he said quietly, "not in the way you move or speak, but in the way you stay." We sat together in the kitchen, just the two of us. No business, no contracts, no quiet resentment hanging between us. Just tea. Steam curled between us like a bridge, not a barrier. I watched him sip slowly, eyes downcast, the edge of his knuckles brushing the handle of the cup like he was trying to steady himself on something small and porcelain and real. "I should have told you everything sooner," he said after a while. Didn't answer right away. The tea was warm in my hands. Familiar. Safe. I began slowly. "You did. Just not with words." He tilted his head, as if waiting. The tea, the humming, the letter in the Bible, the silence. Silence. It had been his language. For years. Maybe for both of us. That evening, after we put my mother to bed, I found myself outside, watching Ethan fix the latch on the garden gate. It squeaked, had always squeaked, but no one ever bothered with it, except now, he did. "You don't have to fix everything," I said gently. "I know," he replied, "but some things are worth mending." I didn't mean to walk toward him. It just happened. I stood next to him, the sky dimming to lavender above us, the earth still wet from afternoon rain. "Why are you doing all this?" I asked. "Not just the marriage, but the care, the silence, the tea." He exhaled, slow and deep, looked at the gate latch in his hand, then at me. "Because it's what I would have wanted someone to do for me," he said. Then quietly, "Because I needed to believe love could start without being asked for." Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my mother's bed and watched her breathe. Steady. Peaceful. On the table beside her, the teacup sat empty, a trace of steam still lingering in the air. It wasn't the tea itself that calmed her. It was the ritual, the effort, the unspoken promise behind it. And I realized something then. Not about Ethan, but about myself. I had come into this marriage believing I was alone, powerless, owned. But here, in this small kitchen with creaky floors and chipped cups, I was being shown something else. That love doesn't always announce itself with flowers or fireworks. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet, in a cup of tea made exactly the way your mother used to, by a man who still remembers her song. There are rooms we live in, and then there are rooms we guard. Ethan had both. After we returned from my mother's house, the air between us was no longer cold. It wasn't warm either, but it had softened, like frost giving way to fog. We didn't speak of what had passed. We didn't have to. Something had changed, quietly, permanently. He didn't retreat into silence the way I expected. In fact, he stopped retreating at all. I began noticing him in places he never used to be. In the morning, reading in the breakfast nook, the sunlight catching in his hair. At night, walking the garden, hands tucked into his coat, face lifted toward the dark like he was listening to it breathe. Once, I passed by the library and saw him at the piano, just sitting, not playing. His fingers rested gently on the keys, as if the memory of music mattered more than the sound. I didn't interrupt, but I watched, and something inside me watched back. It was on a quiet Tuesday, when rain tapped gently on the windows, that I found the door slightly open. The East Room. I had never been inside. I thought it was an office, maybe a storage room. But something always told me without a word that it was private, not locked, just closed. But that day, the door stood open. I knocked, quietly, though it wasn't necessary. "Come in," Ethan said without turning. The room surprised me. It was nothing like the rest of the house. No polished surfaces, no impersonal art. Instead, shelves of books stacked unevenly. A worn leather chair beside a small fireplace. An old record player in the corner, the kind that crackled when it spun. On the wall above the desk hung a single photograph, my mother younger, smiling as she held up a painting in our old backyard. I walked slowly, afraid to disturb something sacred. "She gave that to me," he said softly. "The summer before, I left. You kept it. I kept all of it." He pointed to a box near the window. I crouched down and opened it gently. Inside were old postcards, sketches, faded photographs. Some of my mother, some of me, as a child. One showed me sitting on the front step, clutching a stuffed rabbit, dirt on my knees and a popsicle in hand. I held it like it might vanish. "You were the first person who gave me a reason to feel like I wasn't temporary," he said. "Back then, no one noticed me. But you waved." He smiled just a little. "Every day, from your porch, like I was someone worth waving to. I didn't remember it, but I didn't need to. The memory had lived inside him long enough to be real." I sat down in the chair across from him. The room was quiet, but not stiff. It breathed around us. "Why did you let me in today?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "I used to think privacy was the same as protection," he said. "If no one knew what mattered, then no one could take it." "But that's lonely," I said. "It is," he agreed. "And I was good at it." He looked at me then, not guarded, not careful, just open. "But lately," he said, "I keep wondering what it would be like to be known, even a little." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just reached out my hand, slowly, and placed it on the armrest between us. He looked at it, then at me, and then, without a word, he placed his hand on mine. Not to possess, not to pull, just to hold. And that was enough. Later that night, I stood in the hallway outside the East Room. The door was open. The fire inside still flickered low. There was no lock. There had never been a lock. Only fear. Only memory. But now, the room welcomed me. And Ethan, so used to living behind walls, had begun leaving them open. Back in our bedroom, I placed the photograph he gave me, the one of me as a child, on the bedside table beside my mother's Bible. The past and the present sat side by side, and for the first time, I no longer felt like a guest in someone else's house. I felt like I had come home. Grief doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes as stillness, the kind of stillness that settles into a room before anyone speaks. The kind that lingers in the folds of a blanket that still smells like the person you loved. The kind that makes you whisper, even when no one is asleep. My mother died on a quiet morning in October. There was no struggle, no gasping breath, just a soft exhale, like a sigh after a long, beautiful song. I wasn't there, but Ethan was. He had come earlier than me that day, said he felt something. I had been running late, traffic, errands, excuses that seem so foolish now. By the time I arrived, he was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. His thumb gently traced over her wrist, even though her pulse was already gone. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't need to. "She didn't feel alone," he said softly, as if it were the only thing that mattered. And maybe it was. The funeral was small. The kind of service she would have wanted. Simple, honest, a few close neighbors, some old church friends, a minister who remembered her fondly from the food pantry she used to volunteer at. No long speeches, just hymns. The kind that echo in your chest long after the last note. Ethan stood behind me the entire time. Not close enough to crowd, just there. He never once tried to take my hand. But when the final hymn ended, and I felt my knees begin to give, he stepped forward and placed his palm against the small of my back. A single touch, enough to hold me up. It wasn't what people would call a romantic gesture, but I've never felt more loved in my life. We returned to the house together. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, unable to sit, unable to stand still. Grief made everything both too heavy and too hollow. Ethan brewed tea, jasmine as always, and left it on the kitchen table without a word. When I finally sat down, I noticed a small envelope beside the cup. My name, written in my mother's handwriting. Faded, trembling ink. The seal was unbroken. I stared at it for a long time. Some letters are like doors. You're afraid to open them, because you know once you do, you can't pretend the words inside don't exist. I opened it anyway. Her voice came to me through paper and ink, steady even in its fragility. My sweet girl, if you are reading this, it means I've gone where all love eventually returns. Don't be afraid. I've had a full life, and loving you is the best part of it. I stopped reading for a moment. My chest ached. I could feel Ethan watching me from the kitchen doorway, silent. I know you were afraid the day you married him. I saw it in your eyes, even if you tried to smile through it. But I also saw something else, a seed, a chance. I didn't say anything because you needed to find it on your own. Lon, love doesn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like moss on stone. It clings, it roots, it stays. Ethan is not your father, and you are not me. But both of you carry the pieces of those who came before you. And that means you get to choose what to keep, and what to let go. Let go of fear, my daughter. You are stronger than you know. At the bottom of the letter was a single line. If he brings you tea, the way I used to, don't push him away. That's his way of saying he's learning how to stay. Folded the letter with shaking hands. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat there, the scent of jasmine and paper rising around me like a prayer. Ethan stepped closer, as if sensing something had shifted. She wrote to you? He asked. I nodded. She wrote to us. Then I handed him the letter. He didn't read it aloud, just stood there, the envelope in one hand, his other resting gently on the back of my chair. I don't know how to be this, he whispered, but I'm trying. I looked up at him, really seeing him, this man who had once lived behind glass and contracts, now standing bare in his grief and quiet effort. You don't have to be perfect, I said. Just real. That night, we lit a candle by her window and let it burn until dawn. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Grief had settled beside us, but so had grace. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a little girl curled in my mother's lap. Safe. The maple tree behind the house was old, older than the porch, older than the cracked steps that led down into the yard. My mother had planted it when I was a baby, or so she used to say. It had grown tall and patient, watching over seasons of burnt pies, backyard blankets, and quiet heartbreaks. She loved that tree. In fall, the leaves would burn amber and rust, and the ground would glow for weeks with their quiet fire. That's where I found Ethan, 1 week after the funeral. He was standing under the wide limbs of that maple tree, dressed in his usual coat, though the morning was already warm. His breath clouded slightly in the autumn air. He had one hand resting on the rough bark, his shoulders slightly bowed, the posture of a man thinking too hard or hurting too quietly. I didn't call out. I just walked toward him, slow steps through the soft grass, and stopped beside him. He turned, and for the first time since I met him, his expression held no defense, no stoicism, no polished reserve, just a quiet ache. "I sold the land," he said, before I could speak. I blinked. "What land?" "The development, the forest bordering the old church. The project my board's been pushing for 3 years. He paused. "It's done. I signed it away this morning." I stared at him, stunned. That land was his company's crown jewel. I'd overheard enough conversations, enough late-night phone calls, to know what it meant. Prestige, power, profit. Gone. "Why?" I asked, barely whispering. His voice was steady, but something in it frayed around the edges. "Because she loved this place. And because you did too." He looked up into the branches above us, where the last of the golden leaves were clinging against the wind. "I didn't grow up with roots," he said. "We moved every time the rent was late or the silence got too loud. But this yard, this tree, this was the first place that ever felt like it belonged to someone." He looked at me. I wanted to be the kind of man who could protect that, even if it cost something. We stood there for a long time, letting the air fill the spaces where words usually rushed in. The sun was soft, caught in the gold of the leaves. The wind carried the smell of soil and something warm, like cinnamon still clinging to the kitchen walls. Ethan knelt and picked up a single red leaf from the grass. "She told me once," he said, holding it gently, "that the bravest thing a person can do is stay when it would be easier to run." He held the leaf out to me. "I'm staying. Not because of guilt, not because of a promise to someone who was gone, but because he wanted to." And suddenly I realized this was the proposal. Not at the wedding, not in the contract, but here, under a tree that had witnessed the best parts of who I used to be. I stepped forward and took the leaf from his hand. My fingers brushed his. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Then I did something I hadn't done since our first day. I reached up and touched his face. Not in hesitation, but with choice. His eyes closed, just for a second, as if the weight of being seen finally found a place to rest. When he opened them again, they weren't the eyes of a stranger anymore. They were the eyes of someone who had learned how to stand still. Later that afternoon, we sat together on the old porch steps, side by side, knees touching. "I don't know what comes next," said quietly. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I want to build something that lasts. Not because I have to, but because you're the first thing I've ever wanted to stay for." And it wasn't a declaration. It was a promise. One made without ceremony, without audience. Just a man, a woman, and the tree that had known them both before they knew themselves. It's been 1 year. A full circle of seasons since I married Ethan. Grant under a chandelier I didn't choose. In a dress I altered myself. So much has changed. And yet, not all at once. Not in fireworks. Not in declarations. It happened slowly, like light at dusk. The kind that filters through the kitchen window just before dinner, stretching long across the floor, catching on dust and recipe cards in the curve of a smile. We kept the house, not the estate. This house, the one I grew up in, with the warped floorboards and the tree out back. After my mother passed, I couldn't bear the idea of strangers living here. Ethan didn't ask. He just made the arrangements. He built an addition off the back, a small reading room with windows that faced the maple tree. He kept her teacup, too, on a high shelf, next to the painting she gave him as a boy. It's a good house. Not perfect, not pristine, but it holds what matters. Each morning Ethan brews tea, jasmine. Still, he's learned to let it steep a little longer now, he says. He likes the way it lingers, the way it fills a room before a word is ever spoken. I still catch him humming sometimes, not because he's nervous anymore, but because it brings him back to something softer. He doesn't wear suits as often. He's taken to flannel shirts and warm socks, and reading the newspaper in the breakfast nook with one leg tucked under the other like a boy, and me, I've begun painting again. It started small. A sketch here, a brush stroke there. One night he came home and found me sitting at the old kitchen table, sleeves rolled, canvas half covered in burnt oranges and soft blue. He didn't say anything. Just sat beside me, handed me a cup of tea, and watched. That was his way of saying, keep going. We talk now, not just about business or bills, but about who we were, who we still want to become. Sometimes we sit in silence, but it's not the silence of strangers anymore. It's the silence of people who have learned how to listen to what's not being said. Last week, I found something in the drawer by the stove, a letter I hadn't written yet. It was addressed to our future child, not because there's a nursery, yet, or plans, but because hope has quietly returned to this house, like sunlight after a long, patient winter. I wrote, "If you ever ask me what love looks like, I won't tell you stories of roses or grand proposals. I'll tell you about tea steeped at the perfect temperature, about a man who learned to fix a garden gate not because he had to, but because it squeaked, about hands held in grief, about the way we built something from almost nothing, except kindness and time. Tonight, the kitchen glows with that golden dusk again. The light spills over the old wood cabinets, the worn countertop, the kettle steaming softly. Ethan's sitting across from me, reading a book I recommended. His glasses are slightly crooked. There's a smudge of flour on his sleeve. He tried to make biscuits. They were awful. I ate 3. He glances up and catches me smiling. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he says. "Because I remember the first time you wouldn't look at me at all." He sets the book down, leans forward. His voice is soft. "And now?" "Now," I say, reaching for his hand across the table. "I see you." He doesn't reply right away. Just brings my hand to his lips, kisses it gently. The kind of kiss that doesn't promise anything more than presence, but that's enough. That's everything. We sit there until the light fades, until the tea cools, until the house hums with nothing but the sound of staying. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We share more heartfelt journeys just like this, quiet, meaningful, and full of hope. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know.